Okay, welcome everyone to the Grammar Literacy event and welcome back to Dr. Correia Ibrahim. So you were with us last year to talk about picture books, and this year you will be sharing with us a topic that's very dear to my heart, which is the link there is between multilingual literacy and identity. So thank you very much for being back again with us. And so before we start with the question, I would like to introduce you for those who are following who haven't seen you last year or before. Dr. Nayr Correia Ibrahim is associate professor at Nord University and previously head of young learners and bilingual education at the British Council in France. She has over 25 years of experience in English and bilingual education as a teacher, educator, material writer, manager, and researcher in Portugal, Paris, Cairo, Hong Kong, and Norway. So quite a broad experience. And so she holds a MA in TEFL and a PhD in trilingualism, triliteracy, and identity from the University of Reading. She is the treasurer of the Early Language Learning Research Association. Oops. And I'm putting down the volume, sorry. A member of the North Research Group of Children's Literature in ELT, and on the board of the Association for Research on Children's Literature in English in Norway. And her publication includes Teaching Children How to Learn from Data Publishing, which she wrote with Gail Ellis, and numerous other papers on multilingualism and dual language picture books. Her research interests include early years learning, bi- and multilingualism, multiple literacies, language and identity, learning to learn, and children's literature and children's rights. So welcome, Dr. Correia Ibrahim. Thank you very much for being here again with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me again, Yoshito. It's always a pleasure to participate. You are such a wonderfully active individual in multilingualism, so it's fantastic to be part of this amazing event. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So for those of you who are following us, don't hesitate to leave your comments and questions because it's a very broad topic. I have prepared some questions, but if you have anything else that comes to mind, feel free to drop them in the comments and I'll ask them to Dr. Correia Ibrahim. So first, I would like to start by one question, which is a bit broad, but could you please explain how a child's identity is formed and what are the different factors that influence it? So I know it's very broad, so feel free to answer what you want.
Yes, I mean, well, it's broad because identity itself is broad. I mean, it is a very complex and a very multidimensional and yeah, a very it's just a very multi kind of concept because you need to take so many elements into consideration. But I think if you think about how children actually start off developing an identity as such, I think, it basically happens when they sort of realize that, they are an entity, that they are sort of an individual separate from other individuals. They start realizing, they start building sort of and a relationship with other beings in their surroundings, but also with objects in their surroundings, with their natural surroundings. So and then it's also interesting because they sort of also realize that they become what you could call a categorical being. That is, they exist within categories. So you've got an age category, for example. You've got you've got a gender category. You have a size category. You have skills that you might develop that you might be better at than others. For example, you might be really good at sport, or you might be very good at math. And so that becomes sort of an identity as you go through the school system, for example, the sporty one, or the maths person, or the person or the child who likes to learn languages. So all of these elements, you start developing your identity in relation to all of these different elements in your environment. So, social interaction is actually key in developing your identity, and it's social interaction with your parents, so with the adults in your environment, but also with peers, with other children in your environment, with the caregivers. They could be teachers, they could be assistants in the school context, they could be your babysitters. And so as they develop this identity, they sort of become more aware of that they are part of the social and emotional world. And but I think the key here is this active engagement in a community. So, and the realization that you don't exist in isolation. So I think identity development is very relational. It is emergent. I mean, you're not born with an identity. You develop an identity in relation to others and in relation to your surroundings. But it's also very dynamic. It never stays the same. Your identity isn't fixed. You're not even as you develop an identity, it changes throughout your lifetime. It's also reflective. I think that's also very important. Is that when you are positioned or in a situation that suddenly which is new that you need to navigate, you have to step back and reflect on, okay, who am I and how am I going to actually engage in this particular situation? It's experiential. What kind of experiences do you have in these situations? And then so language comes in to this, because language is the way that you exist in a group, because it's the way you interact in a group. It's the way that you become part of the group. So the language and the people that you use the language with, the places where you use these languages, and the experiences you have with these languages are key as well to developing your identity. So so a very complex concept that we all go through, but also very contextual as well, very contextual and very much related to your experience of your life in a particular place and with different people.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's like you said. So when the reason I invited you for this topic is because, so for me, literacy has played a big role in how I identify as bilingual, so French and Japanese, because I had a difficult biliteracy journey with Japanese. It devalued myself as a bilingual, but also I wasn't really sure if I could call myself Japanese, etc. So I had this experience of thinking, because I can't read and write properly, I'm not fully bilingual or Japanese. And so when I saw that you did research on this, I jumped on it and looked at what you were researching. And so I think it's really a really important topic that maybe people might not think about. Could you develop briefly on what's the role of literacy in a child's identity, or how they build their identity?
Well, I think we can relate it back to what I was saying about how you develop your identity. So it's always in relation to, and it's always about belonging, and that's a very important element. So, I mean, the experiences you're recounting is like, I mean, do I belong or not? How do I belong to the Japanese community, because I can't read and write? And I think that is actually quite a very important element in belonging. And I think when you do research with children, that the level of belonging, it's like you can talk about a level of belonging to a particular community, depends on also how they perceive their own language level, language proficiency, and then how other people, how the individuals in that particular context also relate to that child and to the child's level of language. Now, when we talk about multilingualism, we very often focus on the spoken word. So it's very often about speaking. And I mean, can you communicate in a particular language? We very often forget the literacy aspect of multilingualism. And yet literacy is not only important in sort of opening the gateways into that community, because through literacy, you're given access to the written word, to thinkers, to literature, to the way that society, that language has sort of formed or molded that society. And without the literacy, it's a big wall. Not being able to read and write, in that particular language is actually quite a big wall to that that feeling of belonging. So I'm not surprised you mentioned that. And if I can just give you one of a personal experience, because I was born in South Africa with Portuguese parents, and Portuguese was once again that oral language. We used to just talk, Portuguese at home. I'd go to school and it was all in English. So there was a big separation between what I understood Portuguese to be, a language that just existed in this home context, and then English that existed everywhere else, which was so much wider. And I think that's actually very limiting. And it's very limiting in how children perceive their heritage language. So when children are then given access to literacy in their heritage language, they actually start realizing that the heritage language is more than simply that language that they use in the home with mom and dad, and perhaps grandma and grandpa in another country. That language suddenly carries a whole culture. It carries a whole literature. It carries a whole way of being, a whole different worldview. It carries different perspectives on the world. It even carries different words. And I think Japanese is wonderful because Japanese has all these wonderful words that describe concepts that don't exist in other cultures and certainly don't exist in the West. So, and through the literacy, we start having access to all those ways of thinking. And I think it's also really important because you have access to local knowledge, the local knowledge of Japan or the local knowledge of South America or of Guatemala, wherever, your heritage is. You have access to the local knowledge. You have access to perhaps children's literature. And we spoke about picture books last year. And once again, children's literature also comes out of a particular cultural context. I'm using cultural in a very broad sense. I mean, I'm always very careful about that word. But yeah, if you have a Guatemalan writer writing a story about indigenous or with indigenous characters in the picture book, that picture book is going to give you knowledge about that particular culture or that particular context. And so giving children, it's like a gift. It's giving children the gift of their understanding their heritage culture at a much wider level than just being able to ask mom, for this and that in a particular culture, or being able to say hello to grandma on the phone or on FaceTime when we talk to, relatives in a home country. So, you develop not only a much wider identity because you become more empowered. And I think that's a very important word when we talk about literacy across the board. Learning to read and write gives you power. Learning to read and write in multiple languages empowers you to function in these different contexts through the different languages. English is an example. English is a widespread language. It's the international language. I mean, it's the de facto international language. No one really questions that anymore. So we all understand how important it is to learn English, how important it is to develop your skills in English. I mean, people spend loads of money going through years and years of English language courses, and then they do Cambridge exams because they have to prove that they have B2 level, C1 level, a C2 level, etc. Why? Because it's empowering, because knowing the language and speaking it well is empowering. We should have the same attitude towards developing our heritage languages. The fact that it's empowering and then giving time, it's investing time. It's investing, sometimes it's also a financial investment, when you have to support your children and pay for these out of school classes. We obviously need to look at the benefits of that investment in the long run for the children themselves.
And so I think it's important to talk about like you said, the environments where children are growing up because it has a huge influence of how they build themselves.
Mm.
And one of these environments is school. So the
Mhm.
school they go every day during the week. Um, and so, for example, when I went to school in secondary school, it was an international school and I had lessons in Japanese. So being able to read and write in Japanese was important to do well in my studies. I didn't think it would help me in the future, but I thought school values it on if I want to stay in this school, I have to be able to read and write properly. And I think this has put pressure on me. So my question is how much of how much the how important is the environment we put our child into? So when we think of where we're going to put our child into, or which school we're going to put them into.
Mm. It's key, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, there are some
Yeah.
schools that are maybe just monolingual, mainly monolingual students, others that are multilingual, but that don't necessarily teach other languages. Others where, so for example, like mine, where you have to also study in the home language.
Mm.
So it can vary quite a lot.
Yeah. It varies a lot, not only between schools. Yeah, there are different types of schools, but it also varies a lot in different countries because different countries have different language policies. Not all countries have multilingual policies.
Yeah,
Even though, for example, there is a lot of focus on multilingualism. If I were to look at the EU, there's a lot
yeah,
of focus on multilingualism. There's a policy of developing multilingualism in the European Union. Okay, I'm just focusing on this particular block.
yeah,
Now, every education system has taken on, has adopted that policy, and we have, like most in, I would say, in all countries in the EU, children are studying two other languages other than the language of instruction. So let's say if you're in France, you've got French, then you've got English. English, of course, once again, the international language, and then there's another language that children will pick up at the age of 12, and perhaps even a third language that they may pick up at the age of, in upper secondary. That doesn't necessarily mean that the school environment is multilingual. It doesn't mean that the school environment is multiliterate to that extent. I would say that most school environments come from a monolingual perspective. They still have a monolingual perspective in terms of how education happens. So, for example, these different languages will be taught in separate subject slots as
yeah,
separate subjects, and yet multilingualism is all about language mixing. For example, multilinguals
yeah, that's
language
true.
mix.
Yeah,
Their language mix when they speak, and then when you actually write, sometimes you can actually see how children also language mix. Now,
yeah,
so which school is, first of all, even if they are monolingual schools, or they have a monolingual um, base, does the school recognize and acknowledge and celebrate linguistic diversity? Does the school make the languages that the children speak in their school visible in the school, on the school walls, in the classroom walls? Does the school arrange perhaps events where the children can actually show, their different languages and their different heritage backgrounds? That's like a minimum foundational level, if you want, of acknowledging the linguistic diversity of a particular educational context. And then, of course, you can go further. And then there are international schools. Okay, if you go to the other end, international schools. There are international schools and international schools. There are international schools that focus exclusively on English, where the language of
that's true.
instruction is in English, and perhaps there may not be that much focus on other languages. And then there are international schools that have a much wider remit and do acknowledge the languages of the children and actually also tend to develop a curriculum in 2, 3, and sometimes 4 languages. I'm thinking of the European schools, for example.
Yeah,
Then there are international schools that take a very active policy in developing multiple languages. And there is a lovely project called the Language Friendly School. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of it.
Yeah.
So schools get sort of accredited as a language friendly school because they show that they have policies in place that develop or that acknowledge the multilingual diversity in the school context. So what kind of environment, yes, do we want for our children? We want an environment that's first and foremost kind. I'm using the word kind in how it accepts children's diversity, how it acknowledges and how it makes that diversity visible in a positive sense, not in a negative sense, in a positive sense. Because being different, as you're going through a school system, being different is very difficult. Yeah. When you stick out, it's very difficult. So what you want to do is you want to hide that part of you. And I think there's a lot of children that go through the school context where they're hiding a part of themselves because that part of themselves isn't really acknowledged. It's not even that it's not acceptable. Maybe it's them who think that perhaps that part of them, and that's where the identity comes in. That part of their identity doesn't really belong in that particular context. And there's no one bringing that out. There's no one actually communicating to the child, yes, I think that part of your identity is also important here. Let's engage with it. There was this wonderful research project. It was actually a whole project in France, in Diedenheim. They called it the Diedenheim Project. And it was about bringing more linguistic diversity, translanguaging, acknowledging children's linguistic diversity in the school system. It was, and there was one particular story that I remember from the project when I was listening to, it was at a conference where I think the child was Turkish, and through the project, her language was recognized. There was this one moment where she realized that her language was there. She was being asked to speak her language, or she was being, or the teacher said a word in Turkish, and there was this kind of her face just completely lit up. There was this kind of, oh wow, I am seen. Yeah. And I think that's important. So we talk about literacy. Does the school context see the child, but see all of the child, and not just the child who needs to learn English because, they're from Pakistan, now they need to learn English, and we forget about the Urdu and we forget about the other languages because, they need to access the curriculum in English. How do we see the child? Because the way we see the child, and that's the important thing about identity. Identity is not about just me. I don't exist if others don't exist. Identity doesn't exist if others don't exist. So when I exist, I have an image of who I am, but then there's also the image of other people. How do people see me? So are we aware of that in the school system? So how is the school system making, if you want, other children see the child that's different, see the child that has another language? So that's key, and I think that's the first step. And I work quite a lot with that. So how can we make the multilingualism more mainstream in schools, just simply by being kind in that, how do I, seeing the child, acknowledging the linguistic diversity, even before we get to the point of, so how do we actually help the child with reading and writing in their language? Yeah. You need to acknowledge the fact that they have different languages first. Yeah. School contexts don't always do that. Yes, look for multilingual schools, but unfortunately, schools that have a very clear multilingual policy are very often fee-paying schools. They are very often international schools, and not everybody is going to have the fund, the money, to pay for these expensive international schools or bilingual schools. They're usually private, unfortunately. Yeah. So number one, does the school, first of all, celebrate diversity? Does the school acknowledge diversity? And then how can you help your child with reading and writing in a context that perhaps, doesn't have a focus on, reading and writing in Arabic or reading and writing in Japanese. Yeah. I mean, I worked with children who were learning to read and write their heritage languages in after-school programs. And what my research showed, it was actually my PhD research showed, is that the children were very positive about the whole experience. They're very positive about learning all these languages. And I thought they were going to be more like, oh, I have to go to school after school, and I have to go to, like, Persian school on a Saturday morning, and I really don't like that. On the contrary, I think the children were really positive about it because they discovered part of themselves through this experience of being exposed to not just the spoken language, but the written language, and also learning to read and write, sometimes in different scripts, sometimes, etc. So, and then obviously there's also, I'm just carrying on. You must stop me if
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah,
you
it's really interesting.
yeah, because there's also what you can do at home, and that's very
Yeah,
complicated. I actually find that a lot more complicated than finding a heritage language school or a teacher who can help the children, because sometimes, you're the parent,
yeah,
you're not a teacher.
yes,
And those two roles shouldn't be mixed. You shouldn't
yeah,
mix those two roles. And even as a teacher, and I remember very clearly trying to help my son with reading and writing in Portuguese, okay, because he was born in Portugal. I have Portuguese background. I thought, oh gosh, we were living in France at the time. He's never going to learn Portuguese. So I had bought some books in Portugal, and I was trying to get him to read. He was looking at me as if to say, what are you doing? He was like, I ain't going to do this. I am not going to be going through Portuguese school with you after school. And I gave up on that because I could see that he wasn't engaging at all. But then I was a mother, and I think that's why he was like, what's going on here?
yeah,
So sometimes you need that separation between, okay, I'm the parent. Can I also be the teacher?
yeah,
Perhaps, I mean, you might get a situation where the kids are really happy about that, but there may be a situation where the children themselves are asking for that distance, or that's, between mom and being a teacher. And I was a teacher, but he
yeah.
wasn't having it, you know.
But that's interesting because when I asked for people to tell me what the challenges and questions were to prepare this event, there were loads of teachers who told me I'm an excellent teacher, but I can't teach my own child. And so tomorrow, for those of you who are interested, tomorrow at what time is it? At 2 o'clock, I'm going to do a session especially about this. How can we be a parent, but also teach our children? But it's not about changing the hat from parent to teacher, but to find another way. So I'm going to discuss that tomorrow a bit more.
Great. Yeah, because
And
that's really important. Because
yeah,
sorry, I'm just going to step in here. So I'm
yes,
interrupting you, but
please.
I'm just going to step in here and say, when you try and put on that teacher hat and the
Yeah,
kid doesn't see you as a teacher, you are actually harming the language relationship that you've created with your children.
yeah,
And it will do more harm than good by
yeah,
forcing it. So it's best to give that distance. But then, of course, like we were talking last year, bring in stories. Bring in stories. I'm sure this is something that you will be discussing tomorrow as well. But through stories, through the reading aloud, through reading with your children, that's one way of accessing or having, giving children access to the languages through a really nice, fun activity, an activity with that, and also an activity that you do with the mum and the dad, just before
yeah,
bedtime, you're reading a story. But that, I would say, and this is my advice, start really, really early. Start when the children are babies. Have books around, read a book for the child when they're babies, read the books in different languages when they're babies. And then the child slowly gets used to this reading in different languages and gets used to books. And then we'll go and pick the books themselves. Oh, I want to read this book today. And it could be the book in Japanese. Or I want to read this book today. It could be the book in French the next day. But it's the routines, it's creating routines for the children so that the children sort of engage with that and become motivated by that experience. And it's not a lesson, it's not a language
yeah.
lesson.
That's
So
important.
very important to separate the two.
Yeah. And so we have Uta who is following us and who left a few comments.
Ah,
So
lovely.
she's saying that thank you for mentioning the European schools. So the schools where they teach some subjects in the language. So they don't teach the language, but they teach through a subject, and the international schools as well that are quite different.
Mm-hmm.
And then regarding the environment and books, she mentions that when the heritage language is part of the children's life outside of home, it's incredibly empowering. When we then explore the culture and language through books, the environment becomes endless.
Yeah.
No?
Yes, I agree. I absolutely agree with Uta. The children have got to see that this heritage language has a function somehow.
Yeah,
If it doesn't have a function, then is it really only, like, meal times with mom and dad, and they insist on speaking this language with me? Is it, or is it more than that? And as when I was growing up in South Africa with Portuguese as a heritage language, we were also involved in a youth group with Portuguese children. We were also with, Portuguese colleagues or young people at the time. There was a Portuguese club where we used to go on a Sunday. Now, we weren't necessarily speaking Portuguese all the time because, the language of youth became the language of the country. So I think we
yeah,
spoke more, more English with each other than perhaps we spoke Portuguese. But Portuguese was there as well, you see.
yeah,
And then these out of home activities and events, the community events, because the parents were speaking Portuguese. So we would be switching between English and then Portuguese with the adults, and then switching between the two all the time. So translanguaging, very important as well in learning a language and in learning to read and write in different languages. But those events created a need for the heritage language, and they in the mind of the child, they created the language existed for a reason. I have a reason. I know that I need this language because I'm going off to that event and I have to speak Portuguese to the adults in this community or whatever. So yes, now I know that there are certain parents that perhaps are very isolated in their like they may be the one person in that community that speaks the language, so it's not always easy. However, there are so many sort of online resources that we can also use. So the digital world has opened up quite a lot of opportunities for us, even in terms of picture books, for example. Not all picture books are available in all contexts. So if you speak Guarani, the language spoken in Brazil, and you're living in Norway, don't think you're going to find a lot of books in Guarani, but you might have access to some resources online. So, like for example, the World Storybook Project. I don't know if you know about that.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. There's stories in all languages. So there is this access to the online resources that we also need to investigate and we need to access and we need to tell parents about, so that we have a combination of real books, which for me is really important. You really need that book in your hand, but also access to resources online when you don't have them in your environment.
Yeah. Thank you. Am I understanding well by saying that the aim is not necessarily that the child can read or write in the language, but more the vision people around them have about them and the skill. So for example, if the skill is made too important and they can't do it, it diminishes their value. But if, for example, there's not so much focus on reading and writing, but it's more accepting the child as who they are, it can be beneficial in any context.
I think it's both. I think both are important. I think the learning to read and write your heritage language to a level where you can function in that particular context is important. Now, because it's empowering. You can go back to Japan and you can probably function in Japanese. You can read, you can fill out forms, etc. So that
I wouldn't go that far, but I don't get lost that.
Yeah, I mean, no, well, at different levels, but you're probably not completely, probably not a complete outsider because you have had some kind. So there's some navigating you can do in the context. Perhaps, other individuals may have had more of a kind or more contact with the other culture and the other language. And I'm just thinking of, for example, the Portuguese community in France, where and in Germany and and in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, etc., where it's very easy for them to come to Portugal. They grab a car and in 12 hours or in 24 hours they're in Portugal, non-stop driving, or they catch a plane and in 2 hours they're in Portugal. It's very easy. So they come to Portugal for the summer holidays. And there, the children are immersed in the heritage language, and this can happen obviously in many different communities. So that means that those children are probably going to have a better level of Portuguese because they've got a lot more contact with the mother, if you want to say the mother country or the home country that the parents might come from. Now, I had less contact, for example. For me, it was really much more Portuguese school in South Africa. And I went through a whole system of, I actually did 2 of the national exams, the Portuguese national exams, simply because I was in that context. I actually enjoyed languages. I mean, I think when my mother registered me, I was not impressed. I thought, oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to be doing school again. Why are you doing this to me? And then I really enjoyed it. It's that experience of discovering, oh wow, wait a minute, this has got loads of interesting stuff, all the history of Portugal and the whole thing, which you don't get by talking to your parents only. So I think it really, so how much access do you have to the heritage language, to the home language? Some people have more access than others. How much does, and also your parents in the home, how much do your parents speak the heritage language in the home? That's really important to you, or even to each other, or to whoever. And I think with second generation heritage language speakers, it becomes more difficult because the second generation heritage language speakers are already bilingual. And they can switch between languages, and they can just, for example, remain in the language of the country they're living in. Like in my case, it would be English. I can just communicate in English with my son. I don't really need to speak Portuguese to him, so I leave that to his grandmother, that kind of thing. Now, so I think these heritage language contexts are, first of all, very, very diverse. Each one is unique. So I think parents, I suppose the parent needs to think about, what do they want? Do they want to invest in? Because it's a time. You need to invest time, you need to invest energy, and you can't give up. And I think it's very easy to give up when you see your children not being interested, don't have the time for this, I don't want to do this today. That will happen. And you say, oh God, this is too much hard work, I'm not going to do it. But if you don't give up, then your children will thank you later. Because what happens is, when you do give up, they come back to you and say, why didn't you teach me the language? Now I have to learn it as an adult. But it can be at different levels. So yes, of course, that very first step is acknowledging, recognizing, celebrating. It's great that you speak this language. What a wonderful language that you have. I'd like to know more about your language. Can you bring a little poem in Arabic? The child goes home and asks, Mom, do we know a poem in Arabic? And then they can take it home. And that starts involving the parents as well in the education of the child. So those little things like that. However, I think taking it further, where the child is actually going through a whole process of learning to read and write, learning the spelling, learning the sentence structure of a particular language, is very empowering. So I think, but it will obviously depend on families. What can they do? What are they willing to do? How far do they want to go? Are they just happy that the child is literate in the language of the country they're living in? There are all these questions that really only families can answer. And I mean, I've worked with families who've made very different, various different decisions. I would say that the families I was working with, especially in France, I would say the majority of them were desperate to help the children maintain their heritage languages, because sometimes there were 2 languages in the family. They really wanted to help the children to maintain their languages. So I think parents always start with that premise: I want my child to speak my language. Things get difficult after a while, that's it. But giving the children the possibility of accessing, the language through understanding the structure, understanding the pronunciation, understanding the vocabulary, is a gift that I think the children eventually, as adults, always appreciate.
Yeah.
So I would say it's worth the trouble. And then you've got people like Uta who do some wonderful work with parents. I know she works with parents
Yeah.
on a regular, and helps parents navigate this very difficult context, of multiple languages. So, and then there are schools, as we were talking about. So parents just need to do some homework, and perhaps contact, individuals that are out there and that are helping families try to navigate this complex situation.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And we have a few questions.
Mhm.
One is from Marilyn Go, who says, can you touch on literacy and identity if the child has parents from two different countries and the family lives in a third country? I usually have, oh yeah, so I think it's the same thing. So she said that I usually have families living in English-speaking countries, and one of the minority languages are left behind, and they would like to learn one or the other heritage language. I think I can't see the whole message. Uh,
Mhm.
Maybe they leave, so they focus on just one language and leave the other on the side. So when it comes to literacy, so
Okay. Um, yes, I think in a multilingual, when we function in a multilingual context, we don't always need all our languages. I mean, and that's
yeah,
just a reality.
yeah,
So in a, let's just say, if you're in Switzerland and you're living in the French part of Switzerland, it's French you're going to need. You're
yeah,
not going to need Romansh, so you may not ever learn that language.
yeah,
When you're living in France, and even though you have English and Greek perhaps at home, French is what you need. English, because English is the international language, and then Greek sort of sits there. Okay, so what do we do with this? What do we do with Greek? Do we take the child
yeah,
to a Greek heritage language school? It's a different script, but dad's Greek.
yeah,
And sometimes, it's the language of the father that gets left behind because somehow the fathers are not as present. The fathers are not speaking their language to the children. So it's not easy. I think it is a matter of um, a family policy. What do you want your children to do? I mean, do you want
yeah,
them to learn both languages? How are you going to introduce some languages with different scripts? For example, are you going to take the children? Then you don't need to work on English. English is you've got to, for example, this I'm just using these examples because
yeah, yeah,
you've got English in the curriculum, got English in school. Perhaps the focus should be Greek in this case. Is there a Greek community? Are there Greek schools? Go to the Greek embassy. Is there a Greek school? Like, sometimes they have embassies actually, invest in education in those particular languages in different contexts.
mm,
So, yes, I think the risk of leaving one language behind is big, and it does happen. I mean, from a
yeah,
personal perspective as well, it happened in that my son didn't really pick up Arabic. Dad was Egyptian or is Egyptian, and he didn't really pick up Arabic as he was growing up. And then suddenly, as an adult, he started doing courses in Arabic in London when he was studying. He went to Egypt twice. He did a course, 6-month course, a 3-month course in Arabic in Egypt, because that's it. And I was like, oh wow! Even as a parent, I was like, oh wow, this is so fantastic. And my husband was, oh my God, look, he's learning Arabic. And I said, yeah, well, that was nothing to do with you, was it? I mean, you couldn't help.
yeah,
But it just, I think sometimes, I think what happened with my husband was, oh my God, there's so much going on, English, Portuguese, French. He had all this thing going on. So it's a bit much. And it's not actually. It's not a bit much when it becomes normal practice. If my husband had continued
mm.
speaking Arabic to my son would have spoken Arabic to him. That's what they do now. They speak Arabic to each other now. Because
Oh, wow.
my son went to all the trouble of learning the language, and now they speak Arabic to each other, which
That's
I was like,
great.
oh wow, what happened here?
Yeah,
So it does have a positive impact if you even my son maybe would have had a lot more Arabic and this just happens with many children. The language is there, it's in the background, there are some words that you know, but perhaps if there had been more Arabic at home, more communication with my son, with dad from a very young age, then there would have been more Arabic as he was growing up.
Yeah.
And perhaps, there would have been, so the Arabic of childhood, songs, chants, which, my son learned Arabic in a school context and a university context. So, yes, I mean, the risk of letting that language, one of the languages, drop is big, because we always feel that it's too much for the children and it's too much for the parents as well sometimes. However, what do you want your children? How do you want your children to engage with the different languages? So think about the language policy, your family language policy, and what are you going to do about it, and then stick to it. That's not easy, but
I know as a family, so we live in England, we have French and Korean at home. It has always been like a gymnastic of trying to get the two enough input in the two languages, so Korean and French. But also what helped us is, because we try to carry on anywhere, even if sometimes they were more interested in one, like books in one language than the other, or cartoons in one language than the other. But because we kept making the effort, then one language where they were more proficient, the interest they had in this helped them explore like the other language, and it bridged that way. So there are sometimes where they speak more one language than the other, or they speak English instead of one language but not the other. But trying to make the effort, like you said, we have to keep putting the effort, otherwise they won't do it. It can happen later on in life, like in the case of your son. We have to make the effort as parents. And I'd like to read you a few comments we had. So there is I think it was, Uta. Yeah. He said, I observed that the second or third, etc., generation multilinguals become multiliterate in the home languages, because, sorry. Yeah, it becomes more difficult if they are not supported at school or the community. And so that's related to what you were saying about the importance of how we value the people. And that leads me to another question, which is, what can schools do? Because in some schools, maybe they don't have many multilingual children, or in some schools they might have many, but they don't see it as a priority. What do you think could be an easy thing for them to do to promote multilingualism, multiculturalism?
There's so much they can do. The question is, do they want to do it, and how, and who in the school? So I would like to also bring in this concept of advocacy and activism, which is not always necessarily associated with language, but it should be. You need advocates of multilingualism. You need activists for multilingualism. You need the people who are going to do something about it. You need those people who are going to advocate for it. It can be teachers in the school system. It can be school management. Sometimes school management needs a bit of a push. It could be the parents. And I just wanted to refer to a particular project, which is really interesting. It's that took place, or it's still, I think, taking place in America. And I don't know if you've come across the books, The Bilingual Revolution.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah. So I think this started as it started as a small, I think it was a French project where we were trying to introduce French into the schools in New York, sort of a bilingual program.
Yeah.
And but the impetus came from the parents. So and then I think with the support of the French embassy, and I think the person heavily involved in this is called Fabrice Jaumont. He was very much involved in this. Sort of this whole idea of these bilingual programs in New York spread into other languages. but the impetus were the parents. They were the activists, if you want. They would
Okay.
contact the schools. We want a bilingual program in Japanese. We've got so many families, and these families are really interested. We don't only have Japanese families, we also have other families that are interested in learning Japanese, and they would advocate for it. They'd go to the schools. They would need to have, I mean, you know, there's some criteria that obviously they would need to tick. And then, so this actually blossomed into quite a lot of these bilingual sections in primary schools in New York. But that
Okay.
was the activism of the parents. And so you need those individuals who are going to go out there, push for these situations, push for
Yeah.
more focus on bilingualism, push for training. Teachers need training in what bilingualism is, multilingualism, what it is, how, first of all, that first step, how you can recognize it, acknowledge it, how you can blend in, how you can bring in children's languages. They need to understand translanguaging. What is it? How can we use it in the classroom? And they also, I mean, I also use a lot, visual methods in how with my teachers when I'm doing multilingualism with future teachers of English, and how they can use visual methods to engage children in talking about their different languages. And because very often children just hide. I'm in this particular context, I don't really want people to know what other languages I speak, because I don't know how they're going to react to those languages. So schools need a policy that opens up to multilingualism. I think today there are lots of schools who say, yes, of course, multilingualism is wonderful, it's a good thing. I think there's a lot of positivity towards multilingualism. I don't think we're at a stage where, even though there may be still situations that, examples of negative situations towards multilingualism, I think generally people are positive, and I think the policy changes at regional level in the EU, for example, and then the research that has been done over the last 60 years have helped us to see multilingualism as a benefit. However, what are we doing about it? That's the question. And it's one thing say it's wonderful, and then how do we actually bring it into the classroom? How do we bring it into the school system? How do we advocate for it? And that's what schools need to do. Schools play a really important role in society in advocating for multilingualism. They need to know how to do it. So I think there are wonderful policy documents, even at national level. In Norway, for example, multilingualism is mentioned in the curriculum. It's a very positive thing. Not everyone knows how to do it in the classroom, because there are no guidelines. Multilingualism is wonderful, but how does a teacher do it when, with like a class of 6-year-olds, grade ones? What do I do? How do I integrate different languages into my teaching? That's an important step. And I think parents also need to understand what multilingualism is and how they experience it, because they've got it at home, but it's more, what do I do with it, and how can I show and talk to the school system, talk to the school, look, we need to be a little bit more open about other languages. That's the other thing.
So I think the main things to keep in mind is, if our child's school doesn't do anything, we don't need to just complain or do nothing. We can be the ones who initiate things and bring ideas forward. And if we're enough, maybe to run clubs, etc., that would be good. And the second thing is to get teachers trained about multilingualism, how to teach multilingual learners. And you mentioned the Language Friendly School who does that already. And there's an interview that's already in the playlist of the event with Dr. Esther Bethany Green, who works with the Multilingual Learners Learning Research Center. So if you want to watch this video as well, you can.
Great,
there are two parts, like people who are motivated to do it, and the people who are, and even if teachers want to do it, how are they going to do it?
I would also highly recommend, sorry, just back to the parents, when a parent talks to the teacher, how do you talk to the school about multilingualism? So going, you need to go with an argument, and you need to go with, you know, an argument that is supported by research, perhaps by with links to blogs, to perhaps articles that actually show, look, these are the benefits of bilingualism. This is what you can do. So when you go to the school, you talk to the school in a positive manner, and you show them, look, I'm coming with this. I'm giving you this. I'm giving you links to, different people who are working around multilingualism, who have contacts, etc. Then you have the possibility of going, oh, okay, maybe the school then will listen. Going into complaint, that is not going to be very helpful.
Yeah.
And I'm just giving you this because from a personal perspective, I had a colleague of mine who was actually working in France who came to me and said, look, how do I handle the situation? I've just placed my child it was in kindergarten, I believe, in France, and the teacher's complaining. The teacher wants me to speak French at home. And
okay.
I said, no, you don't have to do that. So we worked together. We looked at a list of, sometimes it's just blogs that look at the positive effects, the benefits of multilingualism, the realities of multilingualism, and then they read this, and then suddenly they discover something completely new about what they can do in terms of how they educate children. And that actually was a very positive, we had a very positive result there, where the teacher was much more relaxed about it and was actually grateful, I would say, for having had this conversation with the parent. And the parent said, I've never been bothered again. Everything's fine now. So I think sometimes it's a matter of what kind of communication can you start, can you initiate with the school around multilingualism.
So for parents who want to have that kind of resources, I'm going to put the links in the description of the MLRC that I mentioned, the language-friendly school, and also the bilingual family who used to be called Peach. Now it's Bilingual Family.
Oh, yes.
Who created an educator's guide to explain to teachers what they can do. So with these three things as a starting point, hopefully it's going to help more parents and schools to discuss these things.
Yeah. And then, and there are also organizations, other like Uta and the work that she does. I also belong to another organization. I didn't actually put it in my bio, APAM, which is the Association des Parents, for Multilingualism. And once again, there's also this particular, these interactions with multilingual parents and schools and teachers. And then I think last year, I don't know if last year I wrote a blog on the myths and realities of multilingualism, and I can't remember if I gave you that blog. And it gives you sort of, those myths about multilingualism and where, and how we can counter those myths. Oh my God, too many languages and the children are not going to be able to learn. They're going to get confused. How can we counter those myths that sometimes people come up with, including teachers?
I don't think you shared it with me, but if you send me the link, I can put it in the description as well.
Okay, will do.
Thank you very much. And so we are coming towards an hour. So I was wondering if you had one final thought you wanted to share about the link between literacy and identity, or multilingual literacy and identity.
Yes, I wanted to basically, I suppose I'm going to pick up on something I've already said, and that is empowerment.
Yeah.
The empowering benefits of learning to read and write in all your languages. It is about giving you access to different contexts. It's about belonging to different contexts, and it's about agency. You can then choose what you read, what you discover about the language, because you've got the written language to help you. So empowerment.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for those of you who have followed live and asked your questions. I believe we answered all your questions, but if you have any other, or if you're catching up afterwards and you want to leave some comments and questions, feel free to do so. And so, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today. And in about 15 minutes, we're going to be talking with Professor Jean-Marc Deval about the importance of emotions in the learning process. So if you're interested, I see you in 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Mm.